together with society, but we put business in the lead, Ministry of Economic Affairs. So what they did, they asked the CEO of gas, the National Gas Company, the guy from Shell, so the whole regime, and they appointed them as heads of this process. They were not able to deal with it, and still are having a hard time. In a sense, you could say that a lot of governmental bodies are also part of the regime context and not really interested in achieving structural, fundamental change on the short term. What we then did is try to translate these principles into a framework saying, okay, you can address change in transitions at different dimensions. One is changing how we think. So it's creating a new kind of narrative or discourse or storyline about what is happening. And typically this is not something consensus-based, large-scale debate, but this is typically something that comes from opinion leaders and individuals, on more strategic, on media persons, but it's also something that has to go deep. So this is what we call problem structuring, and it's an essential element of fundamental changes that we studied in the past, that small groups of people start to come up with a new narrative that explains why things are happening. So they create explanations for surprises that they expect in the future. So for example, in the water management in the Netherlands, already in the 70s, people started to see somewhere these dikes cannot be higher, so we have to start to also find ways to live with water instead of fighting it. So their narrative became, we have to also learn to live with water besides only fighting it. And that they sort of tried this narrative out in small-scale projects first. That led to new kind of networks, that led to more funding, that led to sort of debates on regulations. Then they had a sort of the communities of practice around it. They learned from it. They started to question the dominant practice. So this narrative that interlinks to innovative practices that are emerging, and that you can relate to trying to identify where changes in the structure, in regulation or infrastructure or what have you, are needed. What we say is the logic of change in these different domains is different. They are driven by different kind of actors, but you can also organize them in different ways. So typically for this problem structuring and creating these narratives, we use the concept of what we call transition arenas. Really this selective actor approach. For these experiments, we're much more focusing on creating learning environments. I'll give a brief example. So there's now hundreds of these processes have been developing in the Netherlands and in other countries as well. The main idea is that we're all also part of the regime. So as persons, we grow up in an existing context. And we work in an organization. We're also part of a household. You go to school where certain things are taught. We grow up in a society where things are organized in a particular way. So we are all part of a regime. No matter how innovative we are, we also like routines and security and predictability. And that has a huge function in society. But there's almost no spaces where we can really reflect and work on and co-create knowledge or experiences or material outputs, artifacts that are much more working towards an uncertain future. So what the core idea was, we need to create these spaces. So we have the analytical logic on structuring the debate on the process of change. We have an analytical perspective on how to identify power relations and actor networks and agency. And now we complement that with a practical methodology of actually intervening in these processes. So we did it, for example, with these 5 cities in an Interreg funded project, where from Drift we coached transition teams in the local administration to develop transition process in their cities around energy and climate. And typically, what they all did is they went through this process of problem structuring. What is our current regime? What do we want to do? They built up these transition arenas and then came up with these visions. For example, in Ghent, they made this whole narrative, and I won't go into detail, with a vision and some images about what kind of city they wanted to live in. It started out as a climate project, but by involving a diversity of actors and organizations, it became a sustainability project in a broader sense. And the interesting thing, what we of course aimed for, but worked very well, is that it started to reconnect and vitalize and create all these spin-off projects by people themselves. So one of the things in this transition arena was that all the participants had their own personalized magazine, but all the people in the city that had an initiative they want to make famous, they could have their own personalized magazine. So they all told in their own way to their own networks the story about the sustainability transition. But it also led to a whole initiative in the University of Ghent, meaning the campus and the food and so on, but also a whole debate on how the university could play a role in the social transitions. There's a whole cultural movement with greening cultural facilities, but also educating the public, involving the public. There's carrot moths, there's Veggie Thursdays, we just talked about it. So the interesting is that in part these things were already happening, but what happened now is that it creates sort of a common narrative and understanding, and people start to see the relationships. And pretty much this is happening everywhere. I'm sure also in Gothenburg you have all these kind of initiatives, you have companies, you have organizations. The real question in transitions is how to create the common critical mass while allowing for the diversity to really break through these existing regime barriers. With an eye on the time, I think I'll very briefly give this example. This is an old harbor development in our city. And I was told that you have a similar kind of harbor situation, harbor moving out. What are we going to do with the area? There was a huge conflict between the harbor company and the city about what to do with it. The city wanted to build as much houses as possible, while the experts said there's no demand, but they wanted to do it anyway because that's their regime. The harbor said, no, we want to have industry there as long as possible, and there's regulation that you cannot live close to the industry in the Netherlands, so conflict. They said then, okay, let's create a small transition team, do a transition arena process, and it developed a sustainability vision which was mainly about the process of area development. So they said, okay, we need to achieve the highest possible level of sustainability by the highest level of sustainability to be achieved in short-term experiments. So it's going to be one big laboratory for sustainable innovation. Around a number of themes, we're below sea level, so we need to do something with deltas, with water, with energy, with materials. And then very much on the sideline, one of the PhDs involved was in a prize contest from an engineering firm, and they created this image of a floating city and made a company out of it, and I started, which is very much an engineering dream, and they won a prize actually with this design, but it was very much fictional, but it fit really in this narrative of this area, so they adopted it as part of the vision. The vision was supported by the local policymakers, so after this vision was adopted, they started saying, okay, we have to go to the first round of experiments. And if you look closely, you can see the experiment. It's nowhere near this floating city. In Rotterdam we call it the wet balls. It looks like it was built during the last World Cup football, so people thought it was a World Cup football thing, but the interesting thing was that it became much more than an engineering experiment. So it is an engineering idea. We have this water, and that's climate resilient, and we can also do it in a sustainable way, so we can reuse the components. It's almost energy neutral, it filters its own water and so on. So that's one part of the experiment. By going through this envisioning and this context creation, it also became much more a transition experiment. So what happened is that it doesn't fit the Dutch regulation for building. So there's no building code for it, but also the spatial planning, this water area is not designated as a building area. So it wasn't possible. But also the fire department had problems because they couldn't extinguish the fire there. They didn't have any fire boats, or how do you call it? So that meant they had to have two exits, for example. So you see it over there. But the interesting thing being that because of this political backing, what happened is they had to change the regime, basically. So they changed the regulation, saying, okay, we dedicate this area as a building area. So now this is one of the three plans. They're now in the process of selecting through a rather innovative process or contracting the next plan. But now they're going to build huge floating structures on this area. Another design is actually a pyramid, and there are a bit of crazy designs. The interesting thing is in this logic is that going through the shadow track and creating sort of the strategic narrative in which this kind of experimentation makes sense also creates institutional space. And then the experiments themselves, they help to create this process of regime change. So that's really what we learned over the last 10, 15 years. That these are things that really can be managed. I hesitate to say the word. So it's about collectively framing a transition challenge in terms of creating this narrative. It's on the one hand quite analytical and academic. It's an interdisciplinary work. Do a lot of interviews, desk study, literature study, historical analysis, but it also has a social impact. So you create these languages and discourses, and you see a lot of these new words being developed in transition arenas, entering the public debate, and ultimately also policy documents, for example. It's about empowering networks. On the one hand, that's also an academic exercise, thinking in terms of agency, actors, analyzing power networks, different types of powers, but it's also an sort of an impact activity, empowering people. Same goes for enhancing the impact of social innovation and of these experiments, trying to sort of widen their impact, but it's also shedding insights on innovation journeys, and there's a big exchange also with people around niche management and innovation theory on sort of how these processes work. And it's also about structuring social learning. So it's about sort of a typical analytical perspective of evaluating change and how to sort of learn at the level of the system, but it's also inspiring reflexive action. So what I want to show here is that it's in between science and society. And this is why we call it scientificism. This is a bit of an awkward term. Activist research is also an awkward term, so I don't know how to describe it. What we're focusing on more and more is, I want to address it, but but we find more and more that this phase of creating narratives and experiments and networks is really fruitful, and it has impact. But as I said before, early on, it was too naive to think that that is enough to break through the resistance of regimes. Fortunately, in a number of domains, what we see is there are these external forcings, an economic crisis, a Fukushima, political intervention, external impacts that really shake up the regime and really create space for sort of an acceleration of change. So we have these alternatives and these alternative narratives and networks there, and they are able to seize the momentum, but then you get into a whole different kind of dynamics, like the example of Germany shows, but we have a lot of examples at the lower systems levels as well. And then you also need a whole toolkit. So, for example, in the social domain, there's a lot of changes now going on around youth care and healthcare in the Netherlands. We don't have the time to start a transition arena, come up with a vision. It's way beyond that. So the whole system is collapsing. There's all sorts of political changes going on. There's all sorts of pressure. So we need a new set of strategies